one of your talks, it was very, very well crafted. You called it new wine in an old bottle.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So what is the old bottle?
The reason why I used that phrase was the way I think about this is I really want to, from a technical perspective, I really want classical approaches to all serve as scaffolding. So when I say scaffolding, what that means is there are things that we have figured out about the physical world over the last several centuries, starting from almost Aristotle. People have been trying to do this, right, for a long time, trying to figure out different things about the physical world. And robotics, of course, is very much about the physical world because it's a physical entity in the physical world. And of course, in the last century, even within robotics, they've had lots of discoveries and inventions and novel ideas and ways of thinking about stuff. My intention is just to be cognizant of these things and be able to leverage them whenever I can. So what that looks like is I want to use them as scaffolding. Why not just use them directly? Is because the way I think about this is these approaches have been traditionally designed for a very narrow design space. So they usually take a very particular problem, and within that realm, there is a very particular method. And but within that realm, that method, the analytically designed or hand designed method, will perform exceptionally well. Almost to the point that you just can't do any better because people would literally come up with optimality guarantees for these methods. So, but of course, what I'm ultimately interested in is in robots that can essentially work in environments that you don't quite know ahead of time very well. So these are the dynamic and unstructured environments, right? So if you want a robot to operate in these kinds of environments, these methods typically will quickly become brittle because you're operating them outside their design spec. In fact, they come with these design specs. You know what those design specs are because they will lay out the exact assumptions. But every time you violate the assumption, you're just basically flipping a coin. It might work, it might not work. There are lots of nuances. So you can't directly use them. But at the same time, I also don't want to go to the other extreme and say, I'm going to just throw them out because they are limited in their spec and completely come up with a new approach. I'm trying to see what I can leverage still, what I can salvage from these approaches. So in my mind, different projects will call for different things that you can steal from these methods. And oftentimes they look like scaffolding because you are getting at the core intuitions from those methods. You are trying to borrow core design choices from those methods, but you are not going to incorporate any design choices from those frameworks that are particular to the design spec. So part of the challenge is, given a problem space, kind of trying to get a sense of like what kind of tools are relevant, classical tools are relevant here, and then going through the different aspects of those tools to identify which aspects of this design were made specifically to fit this particular problem and is actually resulting in this bottleneck, and only get rid of those but keep the rest that are relatively general, right? So I'll give you an example. So if you think of properties like, I know that energy has to be conserved in a system. I know that at the end of the day, the robot needs to be able to perform a task in a way that's relatively safe and stable, right? So these are very general ideas. They are not particular to a domain or a task. So if these aspects are baked into those frameworks, so you want to just take those ideas. Within those, there would, of course, be other design choices that they would have made to make it work within that design spec. But you don't have to borrow those. That's where you could supplement the framework with learning. So this is why I see them as scaffolding as opposed to just modules you could just throw into your framework. So what kind of scaffolding you could take is the first question. And then the second question is, now how can you combine learning with this? So this would sometimes look like there are elements of this larger skeleton framework where you are replacing modules with learned networks of some sort. That's the most straightforward, relatively simple way to do it. But another way to do it is look at how you would design a learning-based solution and kind of change the way in which you are designing or the robot is learning inspired by these ideas. So sometimes this would look like, I want to use a neural network for this, but I want a certain property out of this. So I need to be able to either regularize or constrain the parameters of my network. Sometimes it looks like I have this, people have come up with this insight like 100 years ago. It's very relevant here. How can we use it? Sometimes it looks like here's an objective function that's largely almost exactly the same as the objective functions before. But then I'm going to parameterize this objective function because I don't know the exact design spec where I would be deploying these robots. So I'm going to parameterize this and learn this. So why you would do this is essentially you are making the learning problem as much as easier as possible for you. And this is why I said it's fine to spend a bunch of time in the lab trying to figure out what are these structures and which ones are generalizable, which ones are limiting, because not all structure is useful. And in fact, not all structures are useful everywhere. You kind of have to find out the confines of this. And part of our research is exactly that, right? So we call them, the overall field is, think of it as like structured robot learning, where you're identifying what structures are useful, what structures are not useful. When do they harm the learning process? When do they benefit the learning process? What are the circumstances? What are the boundaries? So in a way, the motivation is to try to come up with the science of structured robot learning, right? So, which is something we don't quite have now. So even including work in our own lab, we usually study structures in isolation for certain contexts, and we make them as broad as possible, but still they're relatively limited to some design spec, right? I'm not going to pretend like analytical methods have a design spec and that limits them, and somehow these approaches magically don't have one. It's just that they're broader, right? The goal is to make them as broad as possible, but I'm sure there will be limits to each structure that we use. Some structures are more generalizable than others. So then this becomes a problem of, what do you really want from your robot? You want your robot to have like somehow one model that's just a generalist model that can do everything, versus what you find with having robots essentially almost a bag of tricks of different ways of doing things, and then maybe some other mechanism that helps you choose which tricks to employ at what point. How do you mix the tricks together, right? They're just philosophically different ways of approaching the same challenge. I don't think anybody would refute that ultimately you want the robot to be able to do a lot of different things, but the question is, how do you want to encode that knowledge? We don't quite know which is the right strategy to do this, but my bet is currently on being able to have broad skills as much as you can, but in general, accept the fact that you're going to have modularized set of skills or a library of skills, almost have a planning framework on top of that is going to help you decide which ones are the most important ones to actually deploy right now. Or if you encounter a new situation, thinking about like which of my skills from the past are most relevant here. And so that's thinking of the transfer learning problem and figuring out like, how do I fuse the skills that I have? Do I need to learn something new? What do I need to do to learn the new skill? Things like that. So you get to questions like that.